All right, good morning. My name is Tyler Sandlin. I work for Auburn University as an agronomist in North Alabama at Tennessee Valley Research and Extension Center. Today we're going to be covering some considerations for high yield wheat management. And at the outset, I want to say this is primarily focused on North Alabama, where most of my research is conducted. And a lot of this is going to be hitting the high points, by no means an exhaustive list, but just some considerations to obtain some optimal wheat yields. Generally, growers in the area are averaging somewhere between 80 and 100 bushels per acre, and that's what they're shooting for, is 100 bushels per acre on their wheat yields or plus. And just talk about some of the things that we've looked at, some of the things that they're doing, and also other extension systems in place have conducted to help assist in those matters. So just some of the considerations we'll be covering in this presentation will be what we're going to do before we plant and some of the preparations that go along with that, fertility and especially nitrogen management, as that's critical for optimal wheat yields. And I want to say that the bulk of the presentation will probably focus more on fertility and nitrogen management, and we'll touch on some weed management, insect and disease management as well, but not as heavy as we will on the fertility side with respect to nitrogen management. So before we ever put the first wheat seed in the ground, there's some things we need to consider. And first and foremost would be variety selection. And when we think about variety selection, there's a number of tools out there to help us gauge what varieties are best suited for us. One would be variety trials. There are several outlets to obtain variety trial result information, one of which being our Alabama OVTs, and some of which are conducted here at the Tennessee Valley Station. Also other outlets for on-farm trials, and I'll put this plug in that this year we'll be conducting several on-farm trials to help make better informed decisions as far as wheat variety selection. One thing that I would caution is don't go straight to the yield category. Obviously that's what we want. We want high yields, and that's very important, but don't let that be your sole factor in deciding what variety you want to plant or which varieties you want to plant. Also need to look at things that are very critical, such as test weight, lodging potential, and if you get a chance to walk and look at those trials, thinking about disease resistance, susceptibility, things like Hessian fly resistance as well. So multiple factors there when thinking about variety selection, and acreage will determine some of that. So obviously if you're planting 1,000 acres plus, probably want to plant a few varieties, spread your risk over those acres. But if you're planting a smaller acreage, one variety may be suited for you. Do your homework and your research on that, and use the tools that are available to determine what varieties are best suited for you. Think about planting methods. A couple of ways that we can plant and that are commonly done here is either drilled or broadcast. Primarily focus on drilled for this presentation, although we still have several growers that are going to use a broadcast application. And obtain very good results doing that. They've got their system in place and have done well with that. However, if at all possible, I prefer a drilled method when we're talking about managing for high yields, as we have a more uniform stand, more uniform depth, which lends itself to better uniformity and higher yields. We think about seeding rate, first of all. Several years ago, it wasn't uncommon to go at a certain number of pounds per acre, a rate per acre, anywhere from 100 to 150 pounds per acre. And that's not what we want to do. Seed size, as far as seed per pound on variety, can vary anywhere from 10,000 seed per pound up to 15 to 20,000 seed per pound. So a vast array of differences when it comes to seed size. And we want to plant to a specific rate. Several rates are out there, and research to back that up. One rate that has worked really well for us, that we've had great success with, it's very common here, somewhere in that neighborhood of 1.6 million seed per acre. And just using that as an example, if we were to do 1.6 million seed per acre at a variety that was 10,000 seed per pound, that would be 160 pounds per acre. But if you compare that to something or a variety with 15,000 seed per acre, that's only or 15,000 seed per pound, that's only 106 pounds per acre. So you can see why you don't want to use a poundage per acre. You actually want to plant to a rate, and I like that 1.6 million seed per acre have had good success and good results with that. And that will vary on poundage depending on your seed size. We think about depth. We want 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. I'd rather be a little deeper than I had shallow, but 1 inch to 1.5 inches deep. Think about seed treatments. Very common for most growers to at least apply a fungicide to their wheat seed, and then sometimes an insecticide when we're thinking about some of those early season pests like aphids and Hessian fly. But definitely when we're thinking about managing for higher yields, we want to minimize any risk that we could incur. So I do encourage seed treatments, as they generally, in my mind, will pay for themselves. We think about timing. We want to go at an optimal timing as far as wheat planting is considered. And in North Alabama, generally think about the 3rd week of October through the 2nd to 3rd week in November, depending on climate conditions during that season. But 3rd week in October, 3rd week in November, we can go a little later than that, but the sweet spot would obviously be there in the aforementioned time frame. Let's jump into fertility and nitrogen management. First of all, before we hit nitrogen management, we definitely want to soil test, and we're applying our P and K based on soil tests and lime if need be, with the consideration that here we're going to plant double crop soybeans behind our wheat. So as soon as we harvest the wheat, soybeans will be going in behind that wheat crop. So take that into account when you're soil testing, and those factors that need to be considered as far as that goes, as far as P and K. Jumping into nitrogen considerations, fall nitrogen. Need to think about our previous crop, what we had there last year, and just some things to consider. For instance, if we ever had a year where there was drought and there was a lot of nitrogen left over from a corn crop, take that into consideration. Field history and your experience with that field, whether it's stronger ground, weaker ground, as far as your fall nitrogen considerations. And then poultry litter. Quite a few poultry litter users in this area, and definitely want to have your litter tested to have an analysis run so you have an idea of what you're putting out there. With all that being said, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre in the fall is what we would recommend for winter wheat and high yields to really, I guess, establish some of that tiller growth, good growth in the fall, promote good tillering. And we want that, as fall tillers are going to contribute significantly to yield. That's going to be our primary contributor to yield. So we want to make sure we have good fall tillering. And with that, usually 15 to 30 pounds is enough in the fall to achieve that. I generally prefer somewhere 20 to 30 myself, but take those previous mentioned factors into account if you need to back that off. When we think about nitrogen sources, 32% as far as UAN goes, commonly used, and probably more commonly used now is 28005 with sulfur. And I say that, I'll show a picture here. Started showing up several years ago. We were seeing some sulfur deficiencies in some fields. This is one on-farm example where you see the yellowing, the pale yellowing, and the sulfur deficient look. Go out and apply a little sulfur, and you can see that quick response and that green up. So even on Auburn's soil test recommendations, they encourage 10 pounds per acre for all crops as far as sulfur goes. But that's why I really like 28005 as a fertility source when we're talking about our side dress or top dress application in the spring as far as our nitrogen needs are concerned. So when we think about fertility, we're going to be thinking about particular growth stages. Just throw the growth stages chart up there. There's the Zadok scale and the Feek scale. For this presentation, I'll prefer to use the Zadoks as it's a little bit more in depth and helps us time those applications a little bit better. So this is a handy sheet from a publication that Virginia Tech has put out several years ago. It fits us pretty well. We want to use it as a guide, maybe not hard and fast, but I do want to give them credit for that. Their nitrogen management guide for their winter wheat that correlates pretty well with us, and be referencing this chart through the presentation. So we're thinking about after we've made our fall application, the growing season has progressed, and we're thinking about our side dress or our top dress application, some things we want to consider. Are we willing to make a split application, or are we going to make a blanket application? Need to decide that first and foremost. But as we come out there close to that spring green up time, usually mid to late February for us, we're going to do a tiller count and decide whether we need to make an early season nitrogen application. And if we do a tiller count and determine that we don't have enough tillers, that we need to promote more tillering and need that nitrogen application, then we're going to decide whether we need to split that or not. And you can see that on the chart. So let's say that we decide to split. Generally, split applications are going to contribute to a little bit better yields. So I encourage a split application whenever possible. That's not always allowed due to weather conditions, but if you can split, I would encourage it. So we've done our tiller counts. We decide that we need to split. If we go back to our chart, we notice growth stage 25 there on the Zadok scale. That's the appropriate time frame that we're going to be looking at to apply. And you ask, how much do we apply? This, again, is from Virginia Tech and their chart. So they've made this chart that correlates to a split application with that first application at GS 25. So if you had 60 or less tillers per square foot at that time frame, need up to 60 pounds of N or 60 pounds of nitrogen at that application. Don't want to go more than 60 pounds at this time. Also, if we do, we've had good tillering, good promotion of tillering, and we have 100 tillers per square foot or more, essentially no nitrogen is needed at that time, but that chart correlates pretty well to nitrogen applications at the GS 25 growth stage. All right, so we've counted tillers, we've applied our nitrogen as needed, and then when we want to put out the balance of that, our second split, they have tissue test on the chart. Now, that is an option, and I will say that this chart to tissue testing correlates pretty well, but timing is absolutely critical. Tissue testing at the GS 30 growth stage. And I say that because if you tissue test earlier than GS 30, you can have a higher concentration of nitrogen, and the recommendation will not be appropriate for that second split. If you're later than the GS 30 growth stage, then that could be diluted out, and also recommendation would not be appropriate. So GS 30 is critical. Know your stages. And also, if you're going to use tissue testing to apply your second split, you need to make sure you're working with a lab that can return your results in an extremely quick manner of time, and that you probably have the ability to put out your own nitrogen. And that's where the tissue testing fits in my book, where somebody can give you a 2 to 3 day turnaround on your tissue test, and then you have the ability to go and apply that nitrogen yourself rather than relying on a retail organization, because you could be too late. As GS 31 is the joining stage, and we want to have the balance of our nitrogen put out by joining as rapid uptake is about to occur. That being said, if you don't have the ability to tissue test and put out your nitrogen yourself, and you still want to put that split application out at GS 25 and come back at GS 30, purely feel and experience would be a good way to do that. Knowing how much you put out at GS 25, noting how many tillers that you have at GS 30, and making an appropriate decision based on that. We don't want to put a total balance out of over 120 units, as that may contribute to lodging and other issues. So total N needs for the spring, I would say 120 will be top, somewhere between that 90 and 120 range based on tiller counts and growing conditions. That being said, if you're going to do a single application, you're not willing to split, there and again, total, I would want 90 to 120 pounds based on how that crop is performing and growing conditions at that time. Somewhere in between GS 25 and GS 30 would be the time to make that application. That's basically covers nitrogen quick and fast. Definitely not exhaustive, but that's an overview of nitrogen management to obtain higher yields. Talk about weed management real quick. I'm a fan of starting clean before we plant. And when we think about burn down, there are a couple of options before we plant our wheat. When we're thinking about burn down, you can go Roundup alone. And I show this photo you can see the line there where we have a high population of henbit and we're clean on the other side. And the reason being, we burned down November the 11th with just Roundup at a quart before we planted. And although Roundup is not necessarily great henbit material, if you catch it early enough, Roundup can go a long way in the fall. So we can see where that line, that split is made right there where nothing was applied to where Roundup was applied. Just saying, to start clean is very important, and that's one option. If you have a lot of fall germinated mare's tail, sharpen plus Roundup plus some methylated seed oil will be a good route to go to take care of some of that fall mare's tail population and clean some of that up. It's commonly applied here. First shot is another option. Roundup plus first shot cleans up a lot of broadleaf weeds, henbit, keeps you clean before planting. When we think about weed management in crop, a few options depending on what we're going after: henbit, chickweed, some of the main weeds, broadleaf weeds we think about. Harmony Extra is a standby, and generally speaking, we're going to go with 3/4 to 9/10 of an ounce per acre to leaf stage to before the flag leaf is visible. So that's another tool that we can use. You want to use an NIS if you're going Harmony Extra alone. If you're mixing with nitrogen, I would leave the NIS out, as we've seen some burn and yellowing because of that. Think about ryegrass. It seems to be becoming more prevalent, more of a problem. A couple options that are out there are Axial and PowerFlex. You can see the appropriate stages and the appropriate rates. One thing I would encourage producers to do in all situations, not just winter wheat, is try to, again, burn down, clean up as much as possible beforehand. We've done some studies in the fall residuals when we're in another rotation, not talking about wheat, to help clean up that seed bank, clean up that ryegrass population so it's less of a problem in your wheat. But nonetheless, if you do incur that problem in wheat, here are a couple options that help you clean that up in crop. Zidua is a delayed pre that we can use. I don't have it on the screen. Timing is difficult to hit. It is another option as far as the pre-emergent option, but we have to apply it as a delayed pre. And the label will speak to that. Think about Poa annua or annual bluegrass. Osprey would be the product of choice. One thing to remember if you're going to apply Osprey for Poa control is do not apply within 2 weeks of a nitrogen application on either side, before or after. So we want to be in the clear there. And even back to the prior slide, the same with PowerFlex will be a 1 week before or after. So we want to make sure we're clear of that as well as far as nitrogen application is concerned. 1 week before or after on PowerFlex, 2 weeks before or after on Osprey. And you see the appropriate rate. Once the Poa starts to clump, results can be minimal or reduced, I should say, and we can control that as early as possible. That's another reason we encourage a good burn down with Roundup in the system before we ever plant. But if you get into the season and are incurring some Poa problems, Osprey would be product of choice. Just touching on insect management, aphids would be very important as they vector barley yellow dwarf virus, which can cause significant yield reductions in wheat. So going back to our seed treatments in that first slide, thinking about an insecticide seed treatment and or making a pyrethroid application 30 days after planting. Also want to monitor in the spring as well if we have warm growing conditions or a mild winter, scouting for those aphids and applying a pyrethroid as necessary. Hessian fly, haven't had a lot of problems with Hessian fly here in some time, and the reason being we planted resistant varieties. So that goes back to your variety selection, knowing which varieties to plant, which varieties are resistant, and so that's to be taken into consideration. And then cereal leaf beetle around the flag leaf time frame is something we also want to keep an eye on, and all these we're thinking about pyrethroid control with. Disease management. Some of the diseases that are out there, pathogens that are out there, powdery mildew, septoria leaf blotch, stripe rust, and leaf rust. Be scouting and looking and paying attention to those. And we definitely want to keep our flag leaf clean, and we're thinking about flag leaf fungicide applications. We can also go sooner than flag leaf if we have some problems like powdery mildew and clean that up. But a lot of these products listed here are two-way products, or even some three-way products, but triazoles plus strobilurin to protect against pathogens, against diseases, some of the ones that are mentioned there. And just one note, if we're going to make a true flag leaf application, we do have to get coverage on the flag leaf. As I said, we can go before and clean up any problems we have, but if you want to clean up the flag leaf or protect it, you do have to make sure it is emerged, and that's what we run into, is that we make a flag leaf application and we're turning around some 10 days to 14 days later and making our head scab application, which are very close in proximity, and the timing can be difficult there, so that's one thing to note. And jumping into that, fusarium head blight or head scab, almost every grower here, and especially those trying to obtain high yields, you're going to make a protective application on the head for head scab, because as you see here, these are some scabby kernels on these wheat heads. There is no curative effect as far as fungicide goes, so timing is very critical. You're going to do that before the scab occurs, because once it occurs, there is no going back. When we think about our head scab application, a couple of products listed there for Sorrow and for Ramba with the appropriate rates. Timing is absolutely critical. The heads there on the right, from left to right, left would be too early, the middle is optimal timing, and the right would be too late. If you have a large wheat crop, that timing is very difficult to hit. So one useful just rule of thumb is that 90% head emergence will be a good time to apply. You're going to miss some, but you're going to get the majority. And that's about the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, with the narrow window that we have, because that's a very small window to hit. But there and again, if you're looking for optimal yields, a head scab application is absolutely critical. And just reference the website there that's put out by Penn State. It just shows possibility or potential for it being a greater or lesser head scab year, and that's another tool that you can utilize to play into that. Going through a lot of those techniques pretty quickly, but as an overall, just an overview and considerations for high yield wheat management, those are some considerations and things to think about. Appreciate the time and the opportunity, and can definitely be contacted for any further questions. It can be found on the Crop, Soil, and Environmental Sciences website. Thank you.